Hello everybody, this is Soviet Russian Bear, and yes, this is my first video response to another YouTuber. And no, this is not some Russophobic bastard, this is Paul Joseph Watson. And yes, I'm aware that he has much bigger channel and much bigger audience than I do. I don't care, seriously. And no, I have nothing against Paul. I agree with a lot of stuff he says, I watch a lot of his videos, and I agree with most of the things he says about pop music, modern art, and modern world in general. Yeah, the world is mad. He gets no argument from me here. But his recent video about the protests in Hong Kong, there are things I disagree with in this video. Because what I see in those protests is that this is another color revolution attempt sponsored by the Western powers. Because you see, the United States and China are basically at war, at a trade war, information war, basically another Cold War. So before that, nobody heard anything about the Hong Kong protests, but now it's all over the Western media. Coincidence? I think not.
Why are the protesters out on the streets? They have 5 demands. 1. The full withdrawal of a bill that would allow suspects in Hong Kong to be extradited to China.
And do you know why this bill was introduced in the first place? Because people who commit crimes in China or in mainland China or in Taiwan, even Taiwan, escape to Hong Kong from Chinese justice. Criminals who commit criminal acts, such as rape and murder, escape to Hong Kong and walk free and remain unpunished for their crimes. That's why this bill was introduced in the first place, Paul. Didn't you care to research that?
We talked to several people who said that the Chinese government is using mass migration to subsume Hong Kong's identity and weaken its unity. Does that remind you of anything?
Ich auch. Ist doch hübsch. Enjoy difference, start tolerance.
Chinese people are allowed to move to Hong Kong and get immediate access to the jobs market, housing and healthcare benefits. They're even allowed to vote.
I'm sorry, Paul, but you are comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing people who come to Europe from the Middle East, people of different culture, different religion, different mentality, and different ethnicity. You compare it with Chinese migration to Chinese territory. In case you didn't know, Hong Kong is China's territory since 1997. There is no such thing as Hong Kong identity. They are both Chinese people. Yeah, in case you didn't know that.
This destabilization and subversion of Hong Kong is driving a great deal of the resentment, and it goes both ways. Dozens of Chinese taxi drivers in Hong Kong are flying huge Chinese flags from the back of their car.
Again, Hong Kong is China's territory since 1997. Yes, it is autonomous, but it's still China's territory. So, are you telling me that Chinese people are not allowed to fly their flags on their own territory, in their own country, just because the region is autonomous? Well, how would you like if I said that, oh, those filthy American taxi drivers, they fly their Star-Spangled Banner in proud state of California?
There have also been small sporadic pro-China protests in the city, but they're minuscule in comparison to the anti-Beijing protest.
Maybe because they are not as well organized and financed as anti-China protests. You see, in Ukraine during the Euromaidan times, there were pro-Russia protests, but they were also minuscule compared to the Euromaidan protests and pro-EU protests, simply because pro-Moscow protests were not as well organized and not as well financed as the Euromaidan protests. As simple as that. But that doesn't mean that all of Ukraine suddenly became pro-West and anti-Russia.
Despite dressing similar, the Hong Kong protesters are very different from America's snarling, spitting, obnoxious Antifa thugs. Whereas Antifa attacks the media and refuses to be filmed, the Hong Kong protesters go out of their way to protect the media and prevent journalists from being harmed. Whereas Antifa burns the American flag, the Hong Kong protesters fly it proudly.
Of course, Hong Kong protesters want as much media exposure as possible, mainly to show how poor and innocent children they are and how evil and brutal Chinese police is. Basically, almost the same thing as in Kiev. Well, and American flag? Seriously, Paul? America is an ocean away from Hong Kong and a geopolitical rival of China. Geopolitical trade economic rival of China, which is Hong Kong is still a part of China. How many times do I have to remind you that? And basically they fly an American flag, and by that they are basically showing themselves to be a fifth column of a foreign power, of a geopolitical rival. And you say it's like it's a good thing, Paul. Okay, how would you like if American protesters who are protesting government corruption or police brutality suddenly fly a Chinese or a Russian flag at their protests? How would you like that, Paul?
This isn't a bunch of whiny, privileged leftists protesting for rights they already have, just so they can virtue signal about waving a woke banner on social media. This is a nation's youth fighting for the preservation of its future. They're going up against one of the most fearsome military regimes on the planet, a nuclear-armed dictatorship that interns millions of members of minority groups in re-education camps.
Because you genuinely care about China's minorities and you're totally not virtue signaling, right, Paul? As for re-education camps, I don't know what's exactly going on inside of those camps, but from Western media I read that the Chinese government commit a lot of atrocities in those camps. Well, Xinjiang autonomous region is very problematic, and I'm sure China's geopolitical rivals will use Uyghur nationalism and Islamic extremism to try to destabilize China. The same way NATO used Islamic extremists and Kosovar Albanian nationalism to destabilize Serbia, and Chechen nationalism and Islamic extremism to destabilize Russia. That's why I can't say I don't completely support, but I don't condemn China for building such camps, if they indeed exist.
They're risking incarceration, torture, and a nightmare future trapped in China's social credit score system. A Minority Report-style dystopia where dissidents who express the wrong political opinions are prevented from using social media, traveling, or even having bank accounts. Again, remind you of anything?
Dear passengers, people who travel without tickets or behave disorderly or smoke in public areas will be punished according to regulations, and the behavior will be recorded in the individual credit information system.
Okay, the Chinese may go over the top with their credit system. Okay, you may have a point here, Paul. Okay, but the last footage you have shown is from, I assume it's from an airliner or a train. Well, we in Russia actually could use such a system because Russian airlines and Russian railways often suffer from people who get drunk and basically they start some trouble. So maybe it's not that bad after all.
To give you an idea of how intense China's control over propaganda and information really is, a local Catholic priest who didn't want to be named for fear of repercussions said that religious education in China is so tightly controlled that many people have never even heard of Jesus Christ. The Christian community in Hong Kong is standing firmly behind the protesters. On Friday night there was a vigil attended by thousands of participants.
Well, you see, Paul, According to Chinese laws, China recognizes all religions, but there must be some conditions. Those religious organizations must be self-financed, self-affirmed, and self-distributed. So the condition is basically Christianity in China must be free from foreign influence. And this refers to both Catholic and Orthodox Christianity. If this condition is not observed, of course the Chinese governments will take some tough measures.
This preceded the monumental human chain, where protesters linked arms for 30 miles around the entire city. They even climbed up mountains. The event was an homage to the Baltic Way, when 2 million people joined hands around 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, in 1989 to protest against the tyranny of Soviet rule.
Yes, the Baltics freed themselves from evil, tyrannical Soviet rule. But you know of what else they freed themselves? They are now completely free of industry, they are completely free of atomic energy, they are completely free of seaports and sea trade, sea transit. Yeah, and they are also free to travel to more prosperous European countries such as France, Germany, Sweden, the UK, and to work low-paid jobs there. And yeah, by the way, Baltic states, each year they hold parades of Baltic SS division veterans. Yeah, divisions that collaborated with Hitler. But surprisingly, the Western media turns a blind eye to such parades in members of the European Union.
Which reminds us that the Hong Kong protest is fundamentally anti-communist. Chi-Nazi graffiti also adorns walls across the city. The wider Hong Kong population broadly supports the protesters, which is no surprise given that police have fired tear gas inside shopping malls, subways and densely populated residential areas, leading in some situations to angry residents banding together and forcing the cops to leave. Who's responsible for the violence? Police claim they're merely defending themselves against armed mobs and trying to maintain order. But protesters say the demonstrations were peaceful up until riot cops were deployed and tear gas was used against them.
Yeah, I know. Они же дети. They're just children, they're just hanging out, and the evil police shows up and starts violence. Yeah, it's the same in every color revolution scenario. In Moscow protests, during the Euromaidan protests, just ask any Maidan veteran, he will always say that we were all peaceful and the evil Berkut showed up and started attacking us. Come on, Paul, you cannot be serious right now. You either lying intentionally or you don't know anything about the color revolutions and the color revolution technologies.
China has thousands of troops massing in nearby Shenzhen. Will they be sent into Hong Kong to enact a brutal, bloody crackdown? Probably not, experts say. But Chinese culture is all about avoiding embarrassment, saving face. If Hong Kong is still in turmoil, on October 1st, the 70th anniversary of the founding of Communist China, that will be the biggest embarrassment imaginable for Beijing. So they have to do something. And this is China we're talking about. Tiananmen Square was only 30 years ago. What that something will be remains to be seen. But it certainly isn't going to be pretty.
Yes, and here I completely agree with Paul's analysis. October 1st is going to be 70th anniversary of Chinese People's Republic, and a massacre on that day is not going to be pretty for China. It may cause massive repercussions for Chinese economy, it may cause more sanctions, it may cause Western companies pulling out from China completely and returning home to the West. And you see, the Western media coverage of this event will be one-sided. If a massacre happens in Hong Kong on October 1st, the Western media is just going to be, it's evil China, China's armed forces once again shoot unarmed protesters, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, this is going to be a big psyop, and China will be demonized and dehumanized, maybe as bad as Slobodan Milosevic and Serbia were dehumanized during the Yugoslav wars. Yeah, I'm not going to defend Chinese police. Yes, they are brutal, and Russian police is more humane. Sometimes even Russian police is too humane. I mean, Moscow protesters were allowed to do selfies from police buses.
Да, Коль, праздновали все. Всем привет. Праздновал человек, тоже взяли. Вот теперь едем куда-то на...
And I will oppose color revolution attempts no matter where they are taking place. If it's in hell, I will defend Satan's rule against color revolution protests. Sorry, that's how I am, because I've seen what's happening in Ukraine, how Ukraine was turned, the closest nation, the closest people to Russia are Ukrainians, and they have been turned against Russia. Now they're the most anti-Russian nation thanks to color revolution, Euromaidan 2014. And the Atlanticist powers, they never leave attempts to do the same color revolution in Russia. So yeah. So this has been Soviet Russian Bear, and again, I have nothing against Paul Joseph Watson. I agree with a lot of things he says, but I just said things I disagree with in this particular video. So yeah, peace, love and prosperity to you. I am prepared for hate comments made by butthurt Paul Joseph Watson fans. So yeah, go ahead and post them, I don't care. Bye.